It was a Monday morning in 1929. The New York Stock Exchange was unusually quiet. Within hours, fortunes were erased, and the American dream began to crack.
To understand the crash, we need to rewind to a decade earlier, the Roaring Twenties. After World War I, the United States emerged as the world's leading industrial power. Production soared. New technologies transformed everyday life. Cars, radios, refrigerators, telephones. For the first time, ordinary families had access to goods that were once unimaginable. Between 1920 and 1929, America's gross domestic product grew by nearly 40%. Corporate profits surged, average wages climbed, cities expanded. Millions moved from rural towns to urban centers, chasing the promise of a better life. And at the center of this transformation was the stock market. Once reserved for the wealthy elite, Wall Street was now becoming a playground for ordinary Americans.
As the economy boomed, so did people's confidence. Buying stocks became the new national obsession. By the late 1920s, more than 4 million Americans were actively investing in the market, many of them first-time buyers. Newspapers ran daily stock tips. Taxi drivers, farmers, and factory workers were trading alongside bankers. But the real fuel behind this boom was something dangerous: margin buying. Investors could buy stocks by paying only 10% of the price up front and borrowing the rest. This meant that with just $1,000, someone could control $10,000 worth of stock. As long as prices rose, profits were huge. But if prices fell, those debts would come crashing down like dominoes. Everyone believed the market would keep rising forever, and that belief created one of the biggest speculative bubbles in American history. A few voices tried to warn the public. Economists pointed to overproduction, rising consumer debt, and inflated stock valuations. Some bankers quietly grew nervous. But in a climate of euphoria, warnings sounded like pessimism. Even the head of the New York Stock Exchange declared in 1928, stocks have reached a permanently high plateau. Politicians, business leaders, and newspapers all joined the chorus. The future has never looked brighter. Beneath this optimism, the financial system was becoming dangerously fragile. Banks were overexposed. Millions of ordinary Americans had their life savings tied up in the market. A single shock could trigger a chain reaction no one was prepared for. The 1920s stock market wasn't just a financial bubble. It was a cultural phenomenon, a shared national belief that prosperity had no limits. And that made the eventual collapse even more devastating. We'll step into the week when that dream shattered, when optimism turned to panic, and Wall Street faced its darkest days. Picture this. It's Thursday morning, October 24th, 1929. A thin autumn fog hangs over Wall Street. The opening bell hasn't even rung yet, but a crowd is already forming outside the New York Stock Exchange. Inside, traders are pale and silent. The air feels heavy, like the seconds before a storm breaks. For nearly a decade, the market had only moved in one direction, up. But today, something is different. The first orders of the day hit the ticker tape like thunderclaps. Prices begin to fall. Then more. Then faster. Within minutes, the greatest bull market in history begins to crack.
At 10 a.m., the market opens. Panic spreads almost instantly. Investors who had bought stocks on margin suddenly face margin calls, demands to repay their loans immediately. But they don't have the cash, so they're forced to sell, all at once. By midday, a staggering 12.9 million shares have been traded, more than double the previous record.
The ticker tape, which usually ran only minutes behind real time, is now 2 hours late. People outside the exchange are literally reading yesterday's prices, unaware that their fortunes are evaporating inside. On the trading floor, the noise is deafening. Shouting, paper flying, phones ringing. One trader later described it as a nightmare, the like of which I had never seen. Late in the afternoon, a group of the most powerful bankers on Wall Street huddled together in the offices of J.P. Morgan & Co. They decide to make a desperate move, a coordinated effort to buy up massive amounts of blue-chip stocks to restore confidence. It works, temporarily. Prices stabilize, the panic slows. Newspapers call it a turning point. But beneath the surface, fear is spreading like cracks through glass. The weekend offers a brief illusion of calm. But by Monday morning, October 28th, the panic returns, harder. The bankers' temporary fix had only delayed the inevitable. By the closing bell, the market drops nearly 13% in a single day. Billions of dollars in paper wealth vanish. And then comes Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday. It is the day everything breaks. From the opening bell, an avalanche of sell orders floods the exchange. More than 16 million shares trade hands, a record that would stand for nearly 40 years. There are no buyers left. Prices collapse uncontrollably. Major companies lose half their value in hours. General Electric falls from $400 to $283. U.S. Steel crashes. Iconic banks see their stocks shredded. Eyewitnesses recall seeing men and women weeping openly on Wall Street. Some collapse to their knees as they watch their life savings disappear on the ticker. By the end of Black Tuesday, the market had lost $30 billion in value. That's more than the entire cost of World War I for the United States, gone in just a few days. Banks, businesses, and families across the nation are suddenly staring into an abyss. The crash wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Investors who believed the market could never fall were suddenly paralyzed by fear. Credit dried up. Banks, already overexposed, began calling in loans. Businesses stopped expanding. Ordinary Americans, many of whom had borrowed heavily to invest, watched everything disappear overnight. Some withdrew their remaining savings in panic, triggering the first waves of bank runs that would intensify in the months ahead. In the days after the crash,
The country is in shock. Newspapers struggle to find the right words. Politicians insist the economy is fundamentally sound. But deep down, everyone senses that something irreversible has happened. The crash didn't cause the Great Depression by itself, but it was the spark that set off a chain reaction, exposing deep weaknesses in the banking system, consumer debt, and industrial overcapacity. The Roaring Twenties were over. A new, darker chapter had begun.
We'll move beyond Wall Street and into the heart of America to see how this financial collapse triggered bank failures, mass unemployment, and a decade of hardship that would change the nation forever. This is where the story of the Great Depression truly begins. The stock market crash of 1929 was not the end of the story. It was the opening act of a decade that would test America in ways it had never imagined. Jobs vanished, banks crumbled, families were torn apart, and the idea of the American dream itself began to crack. This is the story of what happened when the Roaring Twenties went silent and the Great Depression began. After the crash, millions of Americans hoped the panic would pass quickly. But by 1930, it was clear. This was no short-term downturn. The economy entered a downward spiral. Factories slowed production. Businesses cut costs by laying off workers. And one by one, banks began to collapse. Between 1930 and 1931, more than 3,000 banks failed, wiping out the life savings of ordinary families. There was no deposit insurance. When a bank closed, your money simply disappeared. For ordinary Americans, the Depression wasn't a headline. It was daily survival. By 1932, nearly 1 in 4 workers was unemployed. That's over 12 million people. Breadlines stretched for blocks. Families lost their homes and moved into makeshift shantytowns known as Hoovervilles, named bitterly after the president. Farmers were hit just as hard. Falling crop prices meant they couldn't pay their debts. Thousands lost their land, their homes, and their hope.
In Washington, President Herbert Hoover faced the worst economic crisis in American history. But his response was cautious. Hoover believed the downturn was temporary, that private businesses and local communities could solve the problem without massive government intervention. He rejected calls for direct federal aid to the unemployed, fearing it would weaken individual initiative. But as conditions worsened, this hands-off approach proved disastrously inadequate.
By 1932, frustration had boiled over. Protests erupted across the country, from farmers blocking roads to World War I veterans marching on Washington, demanding their bonuses early. The government responded with force, not solutions. Hoover's popularity collapsed. The Depression wasn't just caused by the stock market or government policy. It was worsened by deeper structural weaknesses. The banking system was fragile, with little regulation. Consumer debt had soared during the 1920s, and in the early 1930s, a new disaster struck: the Dust Bowl. Years of drought and over-farming turned millions of acres of farmland across the Great Plains into dust. Massive storms swept through Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and beyond. forcing hundreds of thousands of families to abandon their homes in search of work elsewhere.
In March 1933, a new voice took the stage, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In his inaugural address, he declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Roosevelt immediately launched a series of bold programs, the New Deal, aimed at stabilizing banks, creating jobs, and restoring public confidence. Within days, he closed all banks temporarily through a bank holiday to stop the panic. Soon after, Congress passed the Glass-Steagall Act to regulate banking and establish federal deposit insurance.
For the first time in years, Americans began to believe recovery was possible. The Depression was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn.
By the late 1930s, America was a nation still scarred by a decade of hardship. Unemployment remained high, factories stood idle, and while New Deal programs had offered hope, full recovery felt just out of reach. But in a matter of years, everything was about to change, not through domestic policy alone, but through a global crisis that would reshape the world. A storm was gathering overseas, and it would pull America out of the darkness.
In the mid-1930s, the New Deal brought partial recovery. Programs like the Works Progress Administration and Civilian Conservation Corps created millions of jobs. Banks were stabilized and confidence slowly returned. By 1937, unemployment had fallen from 25% to around 14%. Industrial production climbed, but the recovery was fragile. A new recession hit in 1937 when federal spending was cut back, proving how dependent the economy still was on government support. As the decade closed, America remained a nation in limbo, better than before, but not yet booming.
In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Europe was thrust into war. At first, the United States remained officially neutral, but as Britain and France struggled against Nazi aggression, America began to shift from isolation to action. Factories that had been idle for years were suddenly needed again to build planes, tanks, ships, and weapons. President Roosevelt launched programs like Lend-Lease, supplying crucial materials to the Allies, and in return, America's industrial engine roared back to life.
What began as economic assistance soon became something far bigger, the full mobilization of the American economy for war.
On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The next day, the United States entered World War II. Overnight, the nation transformed. Factories switched from civilian goods to war production. Car plants made tanks. Typewriter factories produced machine guns. And shipyards ran a 24-hour week. Between 1940 and 1945, the U.S. government spent more than $300 billion, more than all previous federal spending combined.
Millions of men enlisted, and millions more, including women, joined the workforce. For the first time, women worked in heavy industry at scale, marking a social shift that would outlast the war itself. By 1943, unemployment had virtually disappeared. The Depression was over, not through gradual recovery, but through total mobilization.
The war didn't just end the Depression, it fundamentally transformed the U.S. economy. America became the arsenal of democracy, producing more weapons, ships, and supplies than all Axis powers combined. When the war ended in 1945, the United States accounted for half of the world's industrial output. Its cities were intact, its factories were booming, and its workforce was stronger than ever.
In just over a decade, America had gone from breadlines to superpower. From a nation struggling to feed its people to the economic leader of the free world. The Great Depression and World War II were two of the most transformative events in American history. One tested the nation's endurance, the other ignited its potential. Together, they reshaped the government's role in the economy, redefined industry, and launched America into a new era of global leadership. This was not just recovery, it was reinvention.
The lessons of this era echo even today about the fragility of markets, the power of collective action, and the resilience of a nation under pressure.
If this story made you think, imagine what's next. Hit subscribe and let's explore history together.